The duplicate key, I found a freshly cut key to our house in my husband's coat pocket, but our only spare has been in my possession for years. The key was cold and sharp against my fingertips, a small piece of serrated brass that did not belong. I found it tucked deep inside the pocket of Mark's heavy wool coat while looking for a book of matches. He was at a client dinner, one of many that had started filling his calendar these past few months. I'm 48, a graphic designer, and my studio is the spare bedroom overlooking the quiet street we've lived on for 15 years. My world is one of pixels and color palettes, a controlled digital space that feels safe. This key felt like an intrusion from a different, messier reality. It was newly cut, the edges still precise and gleaming under the dim hallway light. We have a simple system, the one we've had since our son was old enough to let himself in after school. One key for me, one for Mark, and a single spare hanging on a tarnished brass hook inside the kitchen pantry. I glanced toward the pantry door, knowing with absolute certainty that the old, familiar spare was still in its place. This meant a fourth key existed now, one I had never seen or discussed. My mind raced through logical explanations, trying to find a comfortable reason. Maybe he had a new office locker, or perhaps it was for a storage unit for his golf clubs, but it was cut in the exact shape of our front door key, a Schlage C keyway I could recognize anywhere. I've sketched that exact shape for a local locksmith's logo. There was no mistaking its purpose. A cold dread, heavy and slow, began to settle in my stomach. I carefully placed the key back into the lining of his pocket, pushing it deep into the corner as if I could make it disappear. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something else. The antique wooden box where I keep old family photos was slightly askew on the bookshelf. I am meticulous about these things. It was always perfectly aligned with the edge. It was just a tiny detail, but it was enough. It was a quiet, unsettling signal that the world I meticulously maintained was no longer entirely my own. Someone else might have access to my space. Our life together was built on a foundation of comfortable silence. 20 years of marriage had sanded down our sharp edges, leaving a smooth, predictable surface. Mornings were a quiet ritual of coffee and shared sections of the newspaper. Evenings were marked by the low hum of the television and easy conversations about work or the leaky faucet. Mark was a good husband by all accounts, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and shoveled the neighbor's walkway. I guess it really started to change when our son, Leo, left for college last fall. The house suddenly felt enormous, and the silence that had once been comfortable began to feel heavy. I tried to talk to Mark about it once, about the feeling of being adrift. He listened patiently before telling me it was just a classic case of empty nest syndrome. He suggested I take up a new hobby or find a new client to occupy my time. He was probably right, so I tried to push the feeling down. His own work became a convenient excuse for his growing absence. There was a huge new account he was trying to land, a project that required late nights and weekend calls. I was proud of his ambition and tried to be supportive, leaving dinner in the warming drawer for him. The warning signs were all there, of course, small red flags I chose to ignore. He started guarding his phone more closely, angling it away from me when a text came in. He once came home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, but he brushed it off. He said he'd been caught in a crowd at a downtown bar while meeting a client. I believed him, or rather, I chose to believe him because the alternative was unthinkable. It was easier to think I was being oversensitive than to accept that our carefully constructed world was fragile. This was our normal, and I was desperately trying to keep it going. I told myself that all long-term relationships have their lulls. We were just in a quiet season of our lives. I waited for 2 days, the silence of the key's existence growing louder in my mind. I decided to bring it up on a Tuesday night, a deliberately ordinary evening. We were clearing the table after a quiet dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables. I pulled the key from my pocket and placed it on the granite countertop next to the sink. I tried to make my voice sound light and casual, like it was a trivial discovery. I asked him what it was for, mentioning I'd found it in his coat. He picked it up and examined it under the kitchen lights, a small, thoughtful frown on his face. He told me it must be the old spare that had gone missing a few years ago. He said he was surprised it had turned up after all this time. The lie was so smooth, so effortless, it felt like a physical blow. I knew for a fact that our old spare had a small green plastic fob attached to it. Leo had put it there when he was a boy, and it was still on the one hanging in the pantry. This key was bare, a piece of clean, unadorned metal. It had none of the tiny scratches or softened edges that years of use would create. It was a lie so blatant and delivered with such calm confidence that it made me question my own sanity for a moment. I felt a wave of dizziness as he tossed it into the miscellaneous junk drawer. He patted my shoulder and told me not to worry about it, that it was just an old key. The illusion of our shared life didn't just crack, it splintered right down the middle. I was looking at the face of the man I had slept next to for 2 decades. Yet, in that moment, he was a complete and total stranger to me. The trust I had placed in him for my entire adult life felt like it was dissolving into thin air. I started to doubt everything, replaying years of conversations in my head. For the next week, I tried to convince myself I was insane. It was far easier to believe I was losing my mind than to accept that my husband was a liar. I told myself that maybe I had manufactured the memory of the green fob on the old spare key. I reasoned that anxiety can play tricks on your perception, creating false certainties where none exist. I watched Mark closely, looking for any other cracks in his performance, but he was flawless. He was attentive and affectionate, asking about my design projects and suggesting we watch a movie together. His normality was a powerful argument against my own suspicions. The guilt began to eat at me for ever doubting him. He was a good man, and I was turning into a paranoid, suspicious wife. One evening, I attempted to voice my unease without mentioning the key again. I told him I'd been feeling anxious lately, that the house sometimes felt unsettling and strange. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me with deep, unwavering concern. He put his arm around me and told me he had noticed I seemed on edge. He gently suggested that maybe the stress of Leo being away was getting to me more than I realized. He even brought up my mother and her lifelong struggles with anxiety, framing my feelings as some unfortunate inheritance. He said he was worried about me and thought it might be time to schedule another appointment with my therapist. His performance was so convincing that I almost believed him. I felt a hot flush of shame, as if he had caught me in some terrible act of betrayal. He had taken my genuine fear and repackaged it as a symptom of my own brokenness. I was the problem to be managed, and he was the patient, caring husband. To prove him wrong, and maybe to prove it to myself, I tried to fix us. I booked a weekend trip to a small inn by the coast, a place we used to love. He told me the idea was wonderful, but that he absolutely could not get away. The new client account was at a critical stage. His regret seemed so genuine. His refusal to go away for the weekend was a turning point for me. My attempts to restore our old normal had failed, leaving me with only one option. I stopped trying to fix things and simply started to watch. The small, unsettling details began to pile up with alarming frequency. I came home from the grocery store one afternoon to find the house strangely cold. The thermostat, which I always keep at a steady 72 degrees, was set to 65. When I mentioned it to Mark that evening, he barely looked up from his laptop. He told me he'd gotten warm working in his office and had turned it down. He said he simply forgot to turn it back up before he left for a meeting. A few days later, I was cleaning the guest bathroom, a room we almost never use. I found a single long strand of blonde hair resting on a clean, folded hand towel. My own hair is short and dark, a stark contrast to this golden thread. Mark's explanation was that it must have come from his colleague, Brenda. He said she'd given him a ride to a meeting, and it must have transferred to his coat. The explanation felt flimsy, stretched thin over a truth I couldn't yet see. The evidence became impossible to ignore when our credit card statement arrived in the mail. I saw a charge for $150 at a romantic Italian restaurant downtown. The charge was from a Wednesday night when he was supposedly stuck at the office finalizing a report. I recognized the restaurant's name. It was a place known for its intimate candlelit tables for two. When I asked him about it, his answer was immediate and practiced. He claimed it was a business dinner with a new supplier, a man who was notoriously difficult. He said he paid with our card by mistake and would pay me back. He apologized for not telling me, saying he didn't want to bore me with the tedious details of his job. Each lie was a carefully laid brick in a wall he was building between us. I wasn't confused anymore. I was just Waiting. I knew that living in a state of quiet suspicion would eventually destroy me. The ambiguity was a poison, and I needed the antidote of a hard, undeniable truth. So here's the thing, I decided to stop looking for clues he left behind by accident. I decided to create a situation where the truth would be forced into the light. My work as a designer means I am constantly researching things online, from font libraries to stock photo sites. My search history is a random collection of disconnected topics, so a few new searches wouldn't seem out of place. I spent an entire afternoon researching discrete security cameras, the kind that look like ordinary household objects. I finally settled on one that was disguised as a small USB phone charger. It was a perfect, innocuous-looking spy that I could plug into the wall outlet in our living room. It had a wide-angle lens with a clear view of the front door and the main sofa. When the package arrived, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the box. The act of planting a camera in my own home felt like a profound violation, a final admission that our marriage was a lie. I was no longer a wife, I was a counterintelligence agent. A week later, Mark announced he had to go on an overnight business trip to Philadelphia. He packed his small suitcase with his usual efficiency, telling me all about his dinner meeting and the next day's presentation. He kissed me goodbye at the door, a quick, familiar peck on the cheek. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I walked into the living room and plugged the camera into the wall. That evening, I sat in my studio trying to work, but my eyes kept flicking to my phone. Just after 9 o'clock, it buzzed with a motion alert. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the live feed. The image was perfectly clear. I saw Mark unlock our front door and step inside. He wasn't alone. A woman with long blonde hair walked in behind him, and he closed the door. He didn't just greet her, he pulled her close and kissed her deeply, a gesture of pure, unguarded passion. The truth had finally arrived. I did not cry or scream or throw my phone against the wall. I simply sat in the quiet glow of the screen and watched them for another 5 minutes. I watched them move from the doorway to the living room, their movements easy and familiar. They opened a bottle of wine that I had been saving for a special occasion. There was no grand emotional breakdown, only a profound and sudden emptiness. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside me, turning off 20 years of love and affection. I calmly stopped the live feed and saved the video recording to a secure folder in the cloud. I backed it up on a separate drive that I hid in my office. My actions were slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in my life. The next morning, Mark called me from his car on his way back from his trip. His voice was cheerful and light as he told me the presentation had gone very well. I asked him appropriate questions and made the right listening noises, my voice a perfect imitation of a caring wife. He had no idea he was talking to a ghost. When he walked through the door that afternoon, my world had been completely and irrevocably altered. He handed me a small box of chocolates from a shop in Philadelphia. He talked about the traffic and complained about the hotel's terrible coffee. I listened and nodded, my face arranged in a mask of pleasant interest. The man standing in front of me was a stranger wearing my husband's skin. Every shared memory we had was now contaminated, every past kindness recast as a potential deception. Our home was no longer a sanctuary, it was a stage. We were two actors in a play, but only I knew the devastating final act. The greatest fallout was not anger or sadness, but this shocking and total indifference. I felt nothing for him anymore, just a cold, clinical curiosity about what I would do next. My world had not exploded, it had simply vanished. The feeling of indifference lasted for about a week. It was a hollow, empty space that soon began to fill with something else entirely. It was a cold and quiet resolve, a feeling of absolute clarity. I was no longer interested in understanding why he did it or in mourning the loss of our marriage. My new focus was singular and sharp. I was going to take back my life. I started by making a secret appointment with a divorce attorney in a neighboring town. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who listened to my story without a flicker of surprise. She gave me a clear, actionable list of things to do before I confronted him. The first step was to protect myself financially. That night, I waited until Mark was sound asleep, his steady breathing filling the dark room. I took my laptop into the kitchen and opened a new private bank account in my name only. Then, with methodical precision, I transferred exactly half of our joint savings into my new account. It felt less like a betrayal and more like claiming what was rightfully mine. The next step was to identify the other woman. An opportunity presented itself when he left his phone on the charger in the kitchen. A notification lit up the screen, a message from someone named Chloe with a heart emoji next to it. It took me less than 10 minutes of searching on social media to find her. Chloe was a sales representative at a competing firm, younger than me, with a bright, manufactured smile. Her public profile showed a life of weekend trips and happy hours. It also showed pictures of her with her own husband. A new layer of his deception was revealed. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was part of a much more complicated web of lies. This knowledge didn't hurt me, it armed me. I was no longer a grieving wife. I had become a strategist, collecting assets and intelligence. I had the video, I had the money, and now I had her name. The power in our house had fundamentally shifted. He just didn't know it yet. Living in the house with him became a grim and fascinating study in deception. I cataloged his lies with the detached precision of a scientist. The late nights at the office, the phantom client dinners, the weekend trips to nowhere. I was no longer just preparing to leave. I was preparing to dismantle the entire fraudulent world he had built. My graphic design skills, once used to create logos and brochures, were now repurposed for psychological warfare. I spent a full day meticulously recreating the email signature and letterhead of his most important new client. I drafted an email that was a masterpiece of corporate praise mixed with veiled menace. The message congratulated him on his recent successes with their account. Then, near the end, it casually mentioned their company's strict moral conduct clause for all senior partners. It spoke of the importance of maintaining a pristine public and private image. The email was designed to make him feel watched, to plant a seed of paranoia in his mind. I sent it from an anonymous, untraceable email address, a digital ghost whispering in his ear. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he read it. I saw his shoulders tense and his face pale as he stared at his phone. For the rest of the week, he was a different person. He was jumpy and irritable, constantly checking his messages and making hushed, tense phone calls in his office. My quiet, calculated action had real-world consequences. I was watching him unravel in real time, and I felt a terrifying sense of power. I was no longer the victim of his lies. I was the architect of his anxiety. There was no turning back now. I was fully committed to this cold, destructive path I had chosen. The tension in our silent home was becoming unbearable. A string pulled so taut it was ready to snap at any moment. All the pieces were now in place. Our 20th wedding anniversary arrived on a cool Saturday in October. I told Mark I wanted to celebrate it properly, just the two of us. I suggested a quiet, elegant dinner at home, a return to the simple intimacy we once shared. He seemed immensely relieved, as if this gesture of normalcy was the absolution he had been seeking. I spent the afternoon cooking his favorite meal, filling the house with the warm, comforting aromas of garlic and rosemary. I set the table with our best china and lit candles, creating a perfect illusion of romantic reconciliation. He came home with an expensive bottle of champagne and a bouquet of roses. During dinner, I was a perfect imitation of my former self, laughing at his stories and asking about his work. I watched the anxiety and suspicion drain from his face, replaced by a comfortable, familiar warmth. He thought we were fixing us. He thought he had gotten away with it. After dinner, I suggested we move to the living room with the rest of the champagne. While he was pouring the glasses, I sat on the sofa with my laptop. With 3 swift, silent clicks, I sent the prepared emails. One went to the head of his department, and the other went to Chloe's husband. Each email contained a simple, anonymous message and the video file of their encounter in our home. Then I put my laptop down and picked up the remote for our smart television. I told him I had a special anniversary surprise for him. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, not with a slideshow of old photos, but with the crystal clear footage from the hidden camera. I watched his face shift from confusion to dawning horror as he saw himself unlock our door. He saw himself pull her inside and kiss her with a passion he hadn't shown me in years. The video played on a silent loop. I stood up and told him that a lawyer had been contacted. I told him his things needed to be gone by morning. There was no argument, no shouting. It was simply the end. He was gone by the next morning, just as I had instructed. He left behind a half-empty closet and the faint scent of his aftershave in the bathroom. The silence he left in his place was heavier than any sound. I did not feel relief or victory, only a vast and unnerving stillness. The house was finally mine again, but it no longer felt like a home. In the weeks that followed, I heard whispers through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances. Mark lost his job due to the scandal with the client. I saw on social media that Chloe had changed her relationship status to separated. I registered these facts with a distant clinical detachment. They were merely the predictable outcomes of a completed equation, offering no satisfaction or solace. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to uncover. The great consuming project of finding the truth was over, and it had left nothing in its wake. A month after he left, I hired a locksmith to come and change every lock on the doors. I watched the man work, his drill whining as it bored out the old cylinders. He handed me a set of new keys, their edges sharp and unfamiliar, just like the one I found in Mark's coat. I hold all the keys now. The house is secure, impenetrable from the outside. But there was no lesson learned from any of this. There was no phoenix rising from the ashes. I destroyed a lie, and the only thing that replaced it was a quiet, empty room. I simply traded one kind of prison for another. The final brutal truth is this: sometimes, when you burn everything down to the ground, all you are left with is the ashes. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.